Welcome to Module 2 of the Shelter and Settlements training course. This module will look at different issues and key cross-cutting concerns that form the basis for a shelter and settlement strategy, as well as how taking them into consideration could help us design a better shelter and settlements intervention. Click next to...
Hello again. This is the second of 5 training modules on humanitarian shelter and settlements assistance. This session will focus on assessment and program design issues and concerns. Key points to be discussed during this session include the critical importance of understanding housing, the main issues that can shape the shelter and settlements response, numerous concerns that can impact program design, and the fundamentals of a shelter and settlement strategy.
When looking at key aspects of housing, there are important differences of consideration between developed and developing countries. In developed countries, most homeowners do not build their own houses. Houses are bought completed, or contractors are hired to build a house. These houses will most likely come with necessary infrastructure such as road access, water, electricity, sewage system, and much more. Often a house in this context has only one function, which is to be a residence for its inhabitants. The construction of a house is also required to be in compliance to laws and regulations, and authorizations must be obtained. These laws and regulations, such as land use or zoning restriction and building codes, are prescribed by the government and are intended for the safety of its inhabitants as well as the well-being of its surrounding environment. Now let's have a look at the corresponding aspects of housing in developing countries. In developing countries, many of the houses are self-built, especially in slums and rural areas. This does not mean that everyone builds their own houses. Some may manage the construction themselves and hire small contractors like masons, carpenters, plumbers, and electricians. This is often the case for those who can afford to pay for it. For the poorest of the poor, it is likely that their houses will be self-built using found and second-hand material. In both cases, the construction is likely to be incremental, an activity to be carried out when surplus of income can be put aside for this purpose. It is also common to find that a house performs more than one function for its inhabitants. Think back to the first module during our discussion about how shelter and housing can also be a production platform, which is critical to survival. Lastly, the houses in this context are often unauthorized, neither for land occupation nor for the structure integrity. As such, these houses are classed as illegal. Looking at all the key aspects, it is not difficult to understand why housing in developing countries is more a process than a product. It is a process that happens over time and something we need to be mindful of before we make decisions on shelter and settlement interventions. Many issues affect shelter and settlements, and in order to understand the shelter need of a given community, an assessment is often carried out. For shelter and settlements, this often focuses on damage and need. So before we go any further, let's make sure we understand what these terms mean and what they could imply. Click on the key words to hear more about them. Need is not spelled damage. So why does damage not equate to need? When one walks into a disaster site and sees the destruction and thinks all the houses have collapsed and that all the collapsed houses will need to be replaced, well, that's not always the case. And this could have a multitude of explanations. Not all buildings are occupied. Some are second homes. Others were not residential houses to begin with. Or the homeowner actually has capacity to self-recover without external assistance. In conflict situations, houses may not be damaged, but displaced communities cannot live there due to personal safety. During the emergency shelter phase, it is also vital to take into account that some families have other means to seek out alternative shelter arrangements, whether with friends and family, through short-term renting, or in community collective centers. So it is important to remind ourselves that damage does not automatically equal need. And damage is not spelled as need. It is also important to look beyond the damage to see the real humanitarian need on the ground. For some families, Their houses might still be standing, but they have lost everything in it, which is often the case with flash floods. These families may still have shelter, but they will likely still require humanitarian assistance. In addition, they may have taken in 2 or 3 other families whose houses have collapsed. They may need additional support to provide shelter to these families. Other houses could have their access blocked off with rubble from other collapsed buildings, be filled with mud, or have no water and electricity. It is important that we consider their wider need for assistance beyond visible damage. Need is not spelled as camp. When the need for emergency shelter is large, it might be easy to say, let's accommodate all these people in one place. Makes it easier for us to deliver our services, coordinate our activities, and manage our resources. Well, the easiest solution is not always the best solution. In the humanitarian sector, camps should be considered a last resort. And this is because camps contribute very little towards self-recovery, provide incentives for people to become dependent on the assistance being provided, and potentially attract those who were not in need of assistance in the first place. Camps are expensive to build and operate compared to other shelter solutions. Camps can also create conflict between camp and host community populations, as well as competition for resources. Investments in developing camps are rarely reused. And shelter is not spelled logistics or even plastic sheeting. It is also important to remind ourselves that shelter is more than just plastic sheeting and logistics such as efficient distribution of materials. Sometimes the quickest solution is not an appropriate solution. It's vital that we also consider other options such as construction material, cash, technical trainings, or rental and host family support appropriate to the actual need of the households. Remember that the support we provide should contribute towards their long-term recovery while providing safe and adequate emergency shelter. One of the most important tasks in an emergency is to identify how you're going to add value to whatever is happening on the ground. And in order to do that effectively, we need to have a good understanding of what is happening. This is often done by carrying out an assessment. There are a few things we need to consider before embarking on an assessment. Click each tab to learn more. It is important to have a clear purpose and framework before you start planning an assessment. You can start to define your assessment by answering these 5 questions. 1. Should your organization intervene, and why? What will your added value be? 2. What should the nature, scale, and details of your intervention be? 3. How should you prioritize and allocate resources strategically? 4. What should the program design and planning involve in operational terms? 5. How do you coordinate with others? Also, remember to date your assessment as things change very fast on the ground. Think carefully about who will be collecting the data, how will the data be collected and analyzed, who will the results be shared with, and who will be the decision maker based on the assessment results. So what is the business we're into? Is it ambulance chasing, or is it market analysis? So what do? We go to the field. We ask our collective partners to assess. We want them to do a market analysis of the situation. So the market analysis starts with the profiles and the process of housing. Often the hardest part about shelter assessments is that the categorization on what is a house and the different level of damage can become subjective depending on who is carrying out the assessment. A large part of our assessment will be carried out through observations. This requires some experiences and structural understandings which could be supplemented by having visual guides on how to categorize damage. These are some examples of graphic damage profiles used in various assessments carried out. Click on the icon to view a sample categorization form that can also be used to profile damage. Let's now look at some examples, and we will talk through issues that come up through the shelter lens. We are going to put you on a quick virtual assessments tour. When you look at each photo, think about what is in the photo, what it means, and how it could affect your planned interventions. Click on each photo and note down your first thoughts before reading its descriptions. Obviously, these observations may not have covered all the issues, and you may have come up with several other ones. Remember that you need as much information as possible before you make any judgment or decisions. It is important to ask questions and incorporate findings from different sources. Can you point out which of these structures in the picture is a house? All of the structures in the picture comprise one house with separate living quarters for members of an extended family. One of the first obstacles you can encounter is how to identify which of the buildings are actually used for dwellings. A house can mean different things in different cultures, and a house could be composed of a series of small buildings rather than one large one. Double counting could be a risk here, and you could end up counting the house with a separate kitchen as two houses. Keep in mind that not all covered spaces are for living. Some damage cannot be seen from the air, and mistakes can be made in this way. In this example, the houses may look intact from the air, though when seen from the ground, they have clearly been in a fire with relatively severe damage. In this picture, it is clear that a lot of houses have been destroyed in a landslide. However, it is also unclear as to how long the other houses will still be standing. Should those houses still be inhabited? Will these people with intact houses be in need of humanitarian assistance? This is another example of damages that are not immediately apparent. This is very common in areas that suffered from longer-term inundation, where flood water had taken a long time to drain out of the area. This house looks like it has survived the flood, but some of its foundation may have been compromised. However, looking at the surrounding, you will see some thatch waiting to be used. This might mean that the owners are planning for a seasonal maintenance or an incremental upgrading is in progress. Remember when we talked about housing being a process? From simply looking at this photo, we may not be able to determine whether some repair work is taking place as the result of self-recovery, or if the house was in the process of being upgraded from before the disaster. You may need to be strategic as you ask questions to clarify these assumptions. This photo shows a clear example of people being resourceful with what has been provided. You can see the plastic sheeting walls, clearly provided by an aid agency. And then you see the mud wall that is an extension. If this was in a camp, it could also be a sign that people are starting to take roots and that camp closure could become drawn out and problematic, as people will want to stay with the houses they have invested their resources and efforts in. Here it is clear that people are lacking resources and material to make safe and adequate shelters for themselves. But it could also be that this is part of a nomadic culture where people build very simple sticks and thatch huts that are meant to be moved and reconstructed seasonally. Now think back to the last photo. You may have thought that the solution there was to provide plastic sheeting, make the shelter waterproof. This is an example of when plastic sheeting alone was not enough, because more skills and knowledge would have been needed, along with some framing material to make this shelter adequate. So during your assessment, you need to assess both available skills and available resources. Often, a public building such as schools or religious buildings are used as emergency shelter or what we commonly called collective center. It is easy to see that this is a very crowded living condition with no privacy being provided at all. These buildings are also usually not planned to be inhabited by such large number of people, and the additional burden on wash and cooking facilities will likely become problematic very quickly. Obviously, when thinking of site planning for camps, the need of families living in them should come first, along with the best way that our services could reach them. Sometimes it is easy to forget and try to make these camps too efficient without social considerations for the families and communities who are living there. Remember that shelter is not a standalone sector. Consideration for wash, health, protection, livelihood, and social well-being should also be part of the consideration. Apart from understanding the current situation of damage, need, and contexts, we also need to understand how their shelters are culturally and traditionally utilized, and assess how the affected population are coping, and how they have coped with similar situations in the past. Ask yourself these questions. What are the main shelter typologies in your target area? How were those shelter typologies affected? What features make each shelter typology resistant to the prevalent disasters? How will the covered living space be configured? What opportunities exist for mitigating future disasters based on traditional coping mechanisms? For example, seismic-resistant construction. It is not uncommon to see some people already building and repairing their houses when you come to do the assessment. If skills and basic resources are already available, is it possible to support this ongoing activity? Whether that's in the form of construction material, cash, or provision of knowledge and trainings in safe construction. Ask yourself these questions. What are the main reasons behind the decision to settle in the current shelter location? When was the settlement constructed? Who owns the land where the settlement is located? Who makes the decision where new houses are located? Is it possible to accommodate more disaster-affected individuals within existing settlements? It is also vital to ask yourself who are the most vulnerable, and how are they coping with lack of shelter? Different stakeholders will be impacted differently by your shelter and settlement intervention. It is important to ask, who are these stakeholders? How are they organized? What are their roles, and what resources do they have? Let's have a look at some key stakeholders often encountered in a disaster environment. Click each stakeholder icon to learn more. Communities vary widely in their capacity to mobilize and organize themselves. It should not be assumed that community participation is a given, especially in post-conflict situations. In addition, communities are diverse, and the methods to mobilize and organize them must be tailored appropriately. Certain community members are more visible than others, and care must be taken to involve the most vulnerable, such as single or widowed women head of households, minorities, elderly, the poor, and the disabled. Leadership should be identified early and engagement strategy defined. Local authorities represent the district and municipal governments. Often they have direct responsibility for social housing, managing local utilities, and regulating land use and planning procedures. Sometimes they have a big stake in the program that can be related to larger policy and political considerations. Private sector often possesses specialized skills and resources that could supplement both local government and international relief efforts. In some cases, they have the capacity to influence the local economic recovery and thus can be helpful contributors to shelter programs. National government. Where possible, post-conflict programs may be an exception. Shelter programs should take into consideration local governments and obtain their support, buy-in. We should be able to determine which institutions are responsible for what, who should be contacted, what are they interested in, and their motivations. Assistance comes in two forms, financial and technical. However, assistance is seldom provided without conditions, and these can complicate and reduce the effectiveness of the emergency response. Clarify donor intentions and determine which aspects of potential programs donors are interested in funding. Donors often have rules regarding what they will support, largely based on a distinction between relief and development. Clarify how long donors will be engaged and how quickly funds will be provided. What sectors are they engaged in? What capacities do they have to address the issues identified? How can the assistance be better integrated? Are NGOs aware of regulations that are in place and obtain necessary authorizations for their projects? Are there any threats and risks for the NGOs related to implementing programs? What is being done to mitigate and reduce these risks? And of course, we're never the only one working in this disaster environment. There will be numerous organizations and agencies working alongside you, and each one will have their own mandate, their own level of capacity and specialties, and own priorities, assessment protocols, and methodologies. This generally includes governmental bodies, UN agencies, international and local NGOs, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements, the military, and civil society groups. Click each tab to learn more. With so many actors on the ground, coordination is also an important aspect of any emergency response to ensure efficient and effective assistance to the affected population. For coordination, questions such as the following should be answered. Who is taking the lead in coordination for shelter and settlement? Are there donors meeting? Are donors having meetings with government officials, with NGOs? Where are they held and how frequently? What more needs to be done? What are the coordination gaps? Are local actors included in coordination? What can be done to improve local actors' participation? Is data being shared timely and appropriately? What is the role of the host country government in coordination process? Following the 2005 humanitarian reform, the cluster system has been put into place to support coordination following a disaster. So during the emergency phase, we have shelter being coordinated by a shelter cluster and temporary settlement, or camps, being coordinated by Camp Coordination and Camp Management Cluster, CCM for short. As you can see from our discussions up to this point, coordination between these two clusters are vital, as one of the key priorities from CCM will be focused around shelter. At the global level, different agencies have taken on the responsibility of being shelter and CCM cluster leads for different contexts. On the ground, it is possible that a different agency with strong presence in the area and sector can step up to take the lead or take on a role within the coordination mechanism. In many recent humanitarian responses, for example, South Sudan, the Philippines, there appears to be a nascent trend towards the merging of CCM, shelter and early recovery clusters into a combined shelter cluster. So you can see that it is not always the most straightforward process. It is therefore important to understand the organizational capacity on the ground. Part of our work is also to evaluate overall response capacity, both of humanitarian communities and host governments, and their policies and priorities in providing assistance. Questions such as the following should be answered. What are the main shelter and settlement actors in this emergency? How do the capacities of the main shelter and settlements actors relate to the core issues? What types of interventions are they carrying out or planning to implement, and where? What are local capacities, and how will they be integrated into your programming? Do the shelter and settlement actors have enough resources to perform what they are planning to do? What are the main gaps in the response? How could your organization contribute towards reducing those gaps? Now let's look at some other key considerations that will also influence your decisions around shelter intervention. Click each image to learn more about the key considerations. Supply chain is something we often rely on heavily for our construction material resources. As such, it is important to understand how the market and logistics have been impacted by the disaster. Availability of local labor and building materials should be assessed and prioritized, as this will also impact local economy. Join in with other agencies to carry out market analysis for availability of labor and material, as well as monitoring their prices. It is very common for prices of construction material to increase following a disaster, and you may be forced to look further afield. Updates of transportation networks should be closely monitored, and ensure your organization has necessary vehicle and warehousing capacity for the shelter intervention being planned. The regulatory framework of planning regulations, planning standards, and administrative procedures involved in obtaining legal shelter can be a barrier to assistance in some countries. These issues are particularly relevant in urban areas and will become more important with rapid urbanization in the coming years. Identify regulatory authorities, the various actors, and their key roles. List actual local regulations and standards, procedures including entry visas, professional accreditation, registration requirements, the use of security escorts, travel security clearance, tax on imported construction material. Compile an inventory of procedures to be followed for construction, including land tenure and occupancy rights. Land tenure agreements should be negotiated at the early stage of settlement planning and include the particular needs of vulnerable groups. This precaution will reduce the risk of evictions or conflicts erupting due to lack of clarity over these issues. What other hazards, in addition to the hazard that caused the disaster, could potentially impact the target population? The field tools that are commonly used to identify hazards and vulnerability include semi-structured interviews with both groups and individuals to obtain both general and specific information on hazards, impacts, vulnerabilities, capacities, community perceptions, underlying causes, hazard interactions, and ideas on appropriate DRR measures. Transect walks with key informants to view the interaction between the physical environment and human activities, focusing on land use and tenure, environmental changes, and physical areas vulnerable to the impacts of hazards. Community mapping of topography, houses, land use, etc., can identify socioeconomic and physical vulnerabilities to hazards and areas safe from them. Historical profiling will help in identifying trends in hazard and vulnerability characteristics. Methods used include group discussions, life histories, and historical tracing. These methods will also reveal trends in food security, livelihood strategies, and environmental changes such as tree cover. Seasonal calendars are used to identify times of stress, hazard occurrence, disease, hunger, debt, migration, work patterns, and job allocation. Gender is a core shelter and settlement issue. Social and gender analysis should be an inherent part of all assessments to obtain information on particular vulnerabilities of different groups within the community, including women, boys, girls, female and child-headed households, minority, ethnic, and religious members, the disabled, people living with HIV or AIDS, the elderly, etc. It is important to avoid exposing people to further harm as a result of shelter and settlement interventions. Participatory assessment with individuals and communities should establish vulnerable criteria for priority assistance and identify groups which require particular assistance. Efficient lighting through the settlement should be provided, with special attention to public and communal areas such as sanitation facilities. Shelter materials and relief items should be distributed based on need, and additional assistance for vulnerable groups in the community may be required to ensure that female-headed households, the elderly, or disabled individuals have equal access. It is important to also have agreed protocol for handling unaccompanied minors and providing safe and ethical referrals when responding to disclosures of gender-based violence. A code of conduct for preventing the sexual abuse and exploitation of the affected population by aid workers must be in place and understood by all relevant stakeholders. Consult with relevant protection actors on standard referral systems and procedures to follow when these concerns arise. Other concerns include security and access. Consider security and access for all stakeholders from the planning stage. Merging of chronic and acute needs. Understand the pre-existing context before you decide on your intervention. Coordination with WASH, Protection Health, and other cluster actors to ensure a more effective and holistic response. Overcoming anti-urban bias. As most of our experiences and tools are based in rural context, there is still a lot of work to do to become more proficient in an urban response. Tents, camps, and prefabs. Understand that the quick-fix solutions such as tents, camps, and prefabs may not be the most effective or beneficial solution for the affected population in the long run. Keep in mind everything you find during the assessment might change in one way or the other. Needs amongst the affected population could worsen within a few weeks or months after the disasters. For example, upcoming rains could exacerbate post-disaster shelter needs, or hunger gap could lower beneficiaries' capacity to negotiate cold weather. You should aim to respond when it's the best time to carry out shelter activities. Many shelter projects have been delayed and compromised by not taking into account the harvesting season, where all the community's labor force will be otherwise engaged, or the approaching rainy season that could put a stop to any kind of construction. Click each marker to learn about the questions you must ask. What are the income patterns in the affected population? When would they have more money to invest? When is the time they need more money? What are the weather variations that can affect shelter delivery? How could the supply and sources of construction materials vary during the year? What are the violence patterns? Any religious or social festival or ceremonies that impact labor or skills supply? How does the supply of key skills vary among the disaster-affected population? Are all the skills available to construct shelter year-round? What are the periods of time when the population has the least amount of food? From all of the issues and concern we have identified and discussed, we have basic fundamentals for formulating shelter and settlement strategy. First of all, it should be shelter-led. However, we should do our best to try and incorporate components of other sectors such as WASH, livelihood, and protection. Even if we're not doing them ourselves, we should identify partners who are working in those sectors in the same area. It should also be opportunistic regarding livelihood, as we have discussed in Module 1. Design of shelter programs should provide the opportunity to identify and discuss social, gender, and environmental issues and possible improvements to shelter and settlements interventions. Use this as opportunities to link up with local organizations to strengthen social networks and increase sustainability of the intervention. Disaster risk reduction should always be incorporated at all stages of the project. This can range from community risk mapping to settlement planning to safer construction techniques. Well-planned shelter and settlement interventions should provide short-term relief while contributing towards alleviating chronic development concerns. And of course, we must at all time remain accountable to affected communities and local authorities.
Key points to remember from Session 2 include Understanding the basics of housing informs shelter and settlements activities. Context, context, context. It's not unlike the real estate industry's mantra of location, location, location. How and what you assess and who assesses are key shelter and settlements concerns. And the elements of shelter and settlement strategy are found in the issues and concerns of the sector. Let's move on to Session 3.